All right, so we are looking at the cardiovascular system, which is larger, but in a weird way, easier than yesterday. A little bit less chemistry. There's still a little bit. Like we are going to talk about like how hormones affect our cardiovascular systems, like ability to speed up or slow down. We're going to talk about like what regulates heart rate and things like that a little bit today. But for the most part, this is a little bit less technical than yesterday's lecture. So we need to be able to describe what constitutes the cardiovascular system, so we'll break it down into its individual pieces, their functions, and then how electrical excitation is spread throughout the conduction of the heart. So we will talk a little bit about like how an electric signal is generated by the heart, and then how that electric signal actually travels throughout all of the heart's fibers. What factors give rise to cardiac output, so like how we can affect our cardiac output, which we know is how we sort of measure how well the heart performs. We'll talk a little bit about maximal oxygen uptake, VO2 max, and then what factors like mess with that VO2 max as well. So, we also know, and we need to know like the differences between like the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, like what speeds your heart up, what slows your heart down. So, if we're looking at it, right? Oh God, and then there's another learning objective. Jeez Louise. Yeah, we will also talk about like systole and diastole. Yeah, we'll talk about blood pressure. Boy, good Lord. All right, looking at your cardiovascular system, right? Let's go ahead and very quickly just like get a top of the definition slide. So the cardiovascular system is comprised of the heart, blood, and blood vessels. It is the system responsible for providing a delivery system of nutrients throughout the body by generating and maintaining pressure. Okay, so it is the system. So the main thing that your cardiovascular system is going to do is generate its own pressure throughout like all of those series of tubes and stuff. Sorry, gosh darn it. Okay. Anybody else needs anything? They gotta wait. All right. So your cardiovascular system, right? It's your heart, it's your blood, and all of your blood vessels. So the heart is kind of the pump that moves everything around. The blood vessels allow everything to travel, and your blood, which we talked a lot about yesterday, actually, is what's going to carry nutrients, and those nutrients are going to be in the forms of like oxygen, sugars in your blood like carbohydrates, amino acids, fats, any materials that you need to get around your body. And it also provides like a means by which like you can remove waste products, right? And waste products, if we talk about like our waste products from yesterday, those are going to be things like CO2. But other waste products include like the wreckage of like amino acids, whenever there's like small bits of amine left over, little bits of waste products, anything that like your liver decides to filter out if it does happen to get through your digestive system. So any of those materials that are like excess materials, your blood is also going to transport. So the other nice things is that it also helps regulate your body temperature. This is one of the ways that we regulate temperature, which sometimes when you're talking about like biology and cells and stuff, you're like, it doesn't seem like body temperature is all that big of an important deal, right? Like you're like, well, all these things are just moving around the way they're supposed to. Why is body temperature so important? And it's like, well, your body's enzymes, actually, those enzymes like your salivary amylase, for instance, like the enzymes that kick off ATP production in other parts of the body, those enzymes are pretty sensitive to temperature changes. Like they only survive at a pretty narrow range of temperature. If we get too cold, your enzymes start to die and they don't function very effectively. And then obviously if we get too hot, those enzymes don't die and we don't function very effectively. Like that's actually why your immune system is designed to give you a fever. like when you start to get when you get sick and your body is like, all right, I got to find a way to like murder this virus, you know, what it'll do is it'll actually raise your core temperature of your body, which obviously makes you feel terrible, you know, like it doesn't feel great, but that's actually that's your immune system trying to cook that virus, because viruses don't survive, and they survive at a very narrow range of temperatures as well. And so what ends up happening is like your core temperature goes up in response to trying to kill that virus, but it also like kind of, you know, kills a lot of the good stuff in your body as well, which is why you lose things like your appetite when you get sick, is your body's like digestive system just killed off a bunch of like, well, your digestive system, your immune system just killed off a bunch of like your digestive system's tools. So then your digestive system's like, well, I'm not very good at breaking down food right now, there's no reason to bring anything in. And so then you kind of experience like a loss of appetite when you get sick. So, you know, temperature, all that to say, temperature is like a really big part of us maintaining like a normal, healthy body, right? So it helps regulate body temperature. It also, like I said, removes waste. It removes excess heat through sweat, and monitors pH and water equilibrium. So like one of the ways that your body like maintains its ability to have like a level pH, and like what's funny is like we're not perfectly neutral when it comes to pH. Like we're pretty darn neutral. Um, you know, like we're fairly neutral, but we're actually just a little bit on the acidic side when it comes to our pH balance. And so like your cardiovascular system actually provides you a means by which to balance that out through like your blood and fluids that are traveling through your cardiovascular system. It's able to sort of like lower pH if it needs to, or raise pH if it needs to, by transporting like different materials to and from different sites throughout the body. And then obviously one of the most important ones is it will distribute oxygen and nutrients to the different parts of the body. Okay. And obviously we kind of know that one. So cardiovascular system, obviously really, really important, right? Now, talking about the overall kind of like what we call gross anatomy, right? You've got the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels, right? Those are the main kind of components of our cardiovascular system. So let's go ahead and start by talking about the heart. The heart is going to be how do I want to? That's so funny. Normally I get like a definition here. So we'll define our heart as a muscular blood pumping organ that is responsible for generating and maintaining pressure. And I know we spent all day yesterday talking about pressure, but your heart is also in charge of like generating its own pressure, right? For instance, like we need to be able to get blood, you know, pushed away from our heart down to our feet, but we also need to be able to get blood all the way back from our feet back to the heart, you know? And I'm not the tallest guy in the world, but at 6 feet, like my feet are not that close to my heart, you know, like, and they got to work against gravity to get all the way back to the heart to, you know, kind of be pumped around again. So that's like a pretty significant distance, right? So luckily we have this like excellent organ that's really good at generating pressure, and that pressure is what, you know, our cardiovascular system is going to use in order to move blood from one area to another, even if it is going against gravity. You know, like if I create an area of high pressure here and an area of low pressure over here, blood will naturally flow to that area of low pressure because it's a gradient, right? And stuff always moves down its concentration gradients. Things will always go from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, unless they're being, you know, specifically pushed against that direction. which would in fact raise pressure, right? So, so that's sort of how your heart actually works. It's a muscular organ responsible for generating and maintaining pressure. Now, your heart is enclosed in this little fibrous sac that's not necessarily part of the heart itself, but it is something that you'll sometimes be asked about. And so it's enclosed in a fibrous sac called the pericardium. Let's do this, pericardium. Okay, so we're going to talk about all the different layers of the heart here, but the outermost layer, if you look at it, this is your pericardium. It's this little kind of fibrous sac that actually like encloses around your heart, and it's there to give your heart something to attach to so that it stays in the center of your chest there. So it's really like where you're able to kind of like hold your heart in place. That way it doesn't have to rely on like these blood vessels that it's, you know, relying on for like delivering oxygen and nutrients and stuff. It doesn't have to rely on those things to like hold in place, right? So there's your pericardium. It's this kind of fibrous sac around the outside. It's also your pericardium is also going to be very mucousy and very, very slick. And that's what allows like the heart to beat on the inside and like the pericardium, your heart to not get stuck to your lungs. You know, we don't want our heart to move when we contract our diaphragm, you know? We wanted to maintain and we wanted to stay in the same place. So this is actually a picture of like somebody with a bad pericardium that has inflamed. I believe that's called pericarditis. Yeah, whatever. We're outside of my depth on that one. That's a medical issue. So that's your pericardium, right? And then inside your heart, the ways that it is like maintaining pressure is it's a series of chambers, right? So it consists of 4 chambers, okay? Those chambers are going to be, let's see here. Yeah, we're not doing them. Okay, so those 4 chambers are going to either be your atriums, which is actually your atria, or it's going to be your ventricles, right? So you're going to see your left atrium, okay? You're going to see your right atrium. You're going to see your left ventricle and your right ventricle. Okay, so those are the 4 chambers of the heart. Now, we'll kind of get into this again in just a little bit here, but the way your heart works, the left side of your heart is your systemic circuit. So your left side of your heart is in charge of supplying the system, and the system is you, with all of its blood, right? So I need to be able to get blood from my heart down to my legs. I've got my left ventricle. That's going to be in charge of like pumping it out, right? So those are kind of the 4 main chambers here. Your left atrium is going to gather oxygenated blood that has returned from the lungs, and it will then drop all of that oxygenated blood into your left ventricle, which will push oxygenated blood out of the heart and deliver it to the rest of the body. Actually, I guess it doesn't necessarily technically deliver it. We should say pushes oxygenated blood out of the heart so that it can be delivered, there it is, throughout the body, right? So that's your systemic circuit, right? You've got your left atrium, which gathers oxygenated blood, and you get your left ventricle, which pushes oxygenated blood out throughout the rest of the body, okay? So atriums, you know, think about like the word atrium, right? I'm curious, like actually what Google's got. Atrium, what is that definition? I'm assuming it's, oh great, it's a restaurant, that's what it is. An open-roofed entrance or hall in an ancient Roman house. Yeah, that's actually not terrible. Like, I actually don't hate that definition because that's kind of what it is, right? It's a gathering site. Like, it's a place where, like, you would go and like the guests would wait, and then you'd be like, all right, let's go to the family room or whatever, right? Like it's a gathering site. That's what the atriums in your heart are, you know? And this one's saying the two upper cavities of the heart in which blood is passed to the ventricles, right? So your atriums are a gathering site for blood. Once blood is returned to the heart, it's gonna drop into your atrium, right? And so if we're looking at that here, here are kind of the different parts of our heart, right? Here's your right atrium, and I know it's on the left side of the picture, but remember, this is an anatomic picture, so it's from the anatomic position. So this is the direction the body is facing. So your right atrium is going to gather deoxygenated blood. That's like blood that's returning back from the body. Then it'll drop into your right ventricle. It'll get pumped out and travel to the lungs, and then it'll come back, and here's that left atrium, right? It'll drop back into the left atrium, where it will then be, that's where it's gathered. Then it'll drop into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it will get pumped throughout the rest of the body. Now, if you're looking at that left ventricle, this is probably the most key player in terms of like what is relevant to us as trainers, right? Like when we're training the heart to get stronger, we're really working on this guy right here, right? I mean, obviously we're affecting the entire heart, you know, but we are really trying to train that left ventricle to get better at pumping and delivering oxygen throughout the body, right? And I know the chamber itself looks smaller, like, you know, like this is a little bit longer and taller, and so it looks larger, but look at how much muscle is stacked around your left ventricle. This is the most muscular part of your heart, and it's actually why your heart slightly tilts. You know, we place our hand over the over like the left side of, like when we're doing like the Pledge of Allegiance and stuff. That is not where your heart sits. Your heart sits basically dead center in your chest, but it does ever so slightly tilt to the left. And that's towards that left atrium there, left ventricle there. So this is the very muscly part of the heart. This is really responsible for pumping blood over super long distances. That's why it's so muscular. You know, like think about like how far your right ventricle has to pump it to the lungs. Like your heart's a couple inches away from your lungs, you know, like your right ventricle doesn't have to pump it very far. But your left ventricle, again, like this thing has to pump blood against gravity up to your brain, and it also has to pump blood all the way down to your legs, which are not close to your heart, right? So this is a very muscular part of our heart here. So the left atrium, right? I guess I should put these, I guess I'll put these in bold. I probably should have. You get your left atrium, which is going to gather oxygenated blood that has returned from the lungs. Your right atrium is going to gather deoxygenated blood that your right atrium is going to gather deoxygenated blood that has returned from the body, right? So this is where you're getting blood, like after it's done delivering all of its nutrients, after it's like dropped off all of its oxygen, now it's filled with CO2. It's going to go to the right atrium for just a second so that it can get gathered with all the other blood cells. Then it'll drop into your right ventricle, and your right ventricle will pump it over to your lungs, and now they can pick, you know, drop off all that CO2 and pick up all that oxygen. So then we go to our right ventricle, which is going to pump deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that it can pick up new oxygen and drop off CO2, right? So they have opposite functions. How are we doing on that so far, guys? Pretty good? Right. So let's go ahead. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
I was just saying, yep.
Oh, okay. All right, so those are, whoops. So those are our four chambers, right? Those are the four main chambers of your heart. Now, another really important part that is huge when it comes to like your heart's ability to generate pressure are all of your valves. Like you'll notice there's a valve that separates your right atrium from your right ventricle. There's a valve that separates your right ventricle from the arteries that are pumping blood to the lungs. There's a valve between the left ventricle and the left atrium. And there's a valve between the left ventricle and your aorta, which is like the main sort of artery heading out of your heart. So we've got all these valves here. And it's kind of funny because the heart's all about like promoting blood flow, but those valves, their job is to prevent blood flow. like their job is to like stop blood flow. And what that does is that allows the heart to fill, but it can only stretch so far. So then there's a high amount of pressure. So when that valve finally opens up, blood comes shooting out of the heart thanks to generating that pressure. So what will happen is like when blood gathers in the right atrium, this valve here will be closed and it will fill up. Then when the heart contracts, that valve will open, and because like the pressure had built up in here previously, all that blood will go rushing right into that right ventricle. Meanwhile, this valve is already closed, so now blood is pooling in here. This valve closes up, and now there's a whole bunch of pressure in that right ventricle. So when this valve opens up, it is ejected from the heart very quickly and travels to the lungs. And the same thing is true in your left side of your heart as well. They're a little bit different. Like these are called semilunar valves. They're like little they're just a really simple valve of two pieces. This is what is called like a tricuspid valve, and it's got three little flaps that kind of make it a little bit different. But for the most part, their function remains the same. Like the whole purpose of a valve is to stop blood flows so that you can generate pressure. It's basically as if you were to, when you're watering your yard and you put your thumb over the hose to like send the water flying farther. By limiting the blood flow, the same amount of water is trying to get through a much smaller space. So there's a much higher amount of pressure. So therefore, it's going to travel further. And that's exactly what those valves do for our hearts. They don't necessarily like, let half blood flow through. They stop it entirely, and then all of a sudden they just let it out. But very, very similar. So again, the outer layer is going to be the fibrous sac is going to hold is called the pericardium. There's all of the four chambers on the inside, and then you've got different layers of the actual heart. So there are like different layers of the heart. Consists of several layers. Okay, and those layers, the outer one is called your epicardium, right? So if you were to look at like the outer wall of your heart, we call that the epicardium. It's at like the epicenter, right? So epicardium. Okay, that's not. So here is, this is pretty good, I guess. So take a look at the heart here. You can see this like, kind of fibrous sac would cover the whole thing. And then you would have this big outer layer here, right? This like kind of thin layer around the outside. That's your epicardium. And the epicardium is a little bit different than the other layers because it's designed to be like, really smooth. And then like that way it doesn't ever get sticky with the pericardium, right? The pericardium is enclosing it, and then you get the outermost layer there. You don't want those layers to get stuck together because then like, if the heart's beating and like it changes position, then that sac might get wrinkled, and then it actually might limit the blood, the heart's ability to contract and expand. So that's your epicardium, and then you've got that's the outermost layer. So the epicardium, which is the outermost layer of the heart. And then you've got what is probably the most important, at least in my opinion, which is your myocardium. This is the middle layer. And again, remember, anytime we see the prefix myo, we are in muscle territory. So this is the very muscular part of the heart. So this is the middle. Whoa, typing today. The middle layer of the heart. It is extremely muscular and thick compared to the other layers, right? So this myocardium is really where like the beating of the heart occurs, right? This is the very muscly part of the heart, and it's all of this tissue in the middle here, right? That's your myocardium. So this is what is made up of like your muscle fibers. I know I've talked about it really briefly in the past, but we've talked about the difference between type 1 muscle fibers and type 2 muscle fibers, right? Type 1 muscle fibers are the type of muscle fibers that are used for like endurance, right? Like your core muscles are type 1 muscle fibers, but your quadriceps have like a mixture of type 1 and type 2. You know, they're able to produce like really strong contractions for a little bit of brief periods of time. But at the same time, they have some type 1 fibers because obviously your quads are responsible for, you know, long distance running and things like that. So you can develop different fibers depending on how you train. Like if you spend more time working on your quads by doing a lot of like cardio and running and like, you know, 50 lunges in one set, you know, that's going to very much develop your type 1 fibers within your quadriceps. Your body's going to make more mitochondria, it's going to make more myoglobin, and it's going to have develop more capillaries to deliver blood flow more effectively. So it's all going to be very like oxygen, you know, dependent. But then if you like were to do like super heavy lifting in your quads, it'll sort of have different characteristics. It'll develop larger muscle sizes, which with a larger muscle size will mean more fluid within the cells, which means it'll have more cytosol, which means it's better at producing ATP with the byproduct of lactic acid. So it gets better at producing lactic acid, but it also gets better at dealing with lactic acid. It'll, you know, have obviously larger size, so then it'll have more fibers, but it doesn't make all that like blood flow stuff that we mentioned, right? Well, if we have that understanding of like type 1 and type 2 fibers, your heart is like type super 1. You know, like this is about as type 1 as it's going to get. This muscular layer of the heart, this myocardium here, this is like, I don't know, type 0.5. This is the very, very, very high endurance tissue because your heart has started beating since before you were born and has not stopped since, or at least I hope so. That is how your heart functions, right? It's been going for years and years and years and years. So we definitely know if we were to look at those fibers, it has a lot of blood flow. It has a whole bunch of mitochondria, and it has a lot of like myoglobin so that it can continually use that to, you know, deliver oxygen throughout those tissues. So this is the most muscular layer of the heart, but it is very much like an endurance type muscle fiber, right? And then finally on the innermost layer, you do have like the inner walls of the heart, which is what's going to be called your endocardium. Okay, and the endocardium are the inner layers of the heart. Okay, this is like the layers that actually make up your chambers. You know, this is the inside wall. So in a weird way, if you think of like these layers, right, we are actually kind of arranged like this as well. Like if you were to look at your skin cells, you would have your outermost layer, you have like an inner layer, and you have like a middle layer, right? And that middle layer contains like a little bit of fat and, you know, might be like where some of your glands are. But like the inner layer is designed to like not, you know, to be really smooth and not have too much friction with any of the other materials in your body. The outer layer is kind of stiff and like protective. And then that inner layer is kind of where we keep, you know, all of our you know, skin's special abilities, the stuff that keeps us warm, our fat tissue and stuff like that. So your body is very much like arranged in this sort of layered version, like in a lot of different ways. Like for the record, like there's way more layers of your skin, if I remember correct. However, like skin, by the way, is like my kryptonite. That is like a type of, like, that's a system that I was like, important to personal training? And they're like, nope. And I was like, great, in one ear, out the other. Like when it comes to like studying the dermis, that is my most limited system. That, and not to make any childish jokes, but the reproductive system, that's another one that I was like, I don't care. So let's look at those three. So now that we kind of understand like these layers, right, we got to understand that like the whole reason we have contractions and relaxations is, again, to, like I said, generate pressure. So if we're talking about pressure here, we got to understand like how much volume of blood can be in our heart at any different time, right? So the volume of blood in each of your ventricle during relaxation, we call that your end diastolic volume. And it's usually about like 130 milliliters in the average person. Obviously, you know, if you're a larger person, you're going to have a slightly larger heart. If you're smaller, you're going to have a slightly smaller heart. But like, that's kind of the difference between those two, right? So the reason we call it end diastolic volume is, so when your heart contracts and relaxes, we have a term for each of those, right? So we have like systole and we have diastole, right? And so systole is the squeezing of your heart, diastole is the relaxation of your heart. And so when we look at like the amount of pressure that your heart is generating, generally we want to have like a pressure of like 120/80, right? And that pressure is like, we want the 120, you know, that's high pressure, right? That's the squeezing of your heart. And so blood's rushing out of your heart, right? But then obviously when you relax your heart, that sucks blood back into your heart, right? And that's your diastolic pressure. That is around 80, or at least we want it to be around 80 in general. And that's what we talk about. We go systole, diastole, and that's pushing blood out, sucking blood in, pushing blood out, sucking blood in. So there's a volume for each of those things, right? At the end of like diastole, when your heart kind of opens up, right? The end diastolic volume is about 130 milliliters when you're resting. And then the volume in like your left ventricle after the end of like systole, it's about 58 milliliters, right? And so like those are kind of the two different versions here. It's not super important, but like you can see like there is a difference in the amount of blood left in the heart. And that also has to do with like, again, maintaining and generating pressure. You don't want to completely empty things because then that results in like a dramatic drop in pressure. During the transition from rest to exercise, this is such a crazy big long like sentence, but sympathetic postganglionic fibers will release noradrenaline in order to increase your heart rate and by increasing the firing rate of your sinoatrial node. So that sentence is super intimidating, but it's actually pretty simple if you know what these things are. So obviously when we talk about our nervous system, we've got our sympathetic nervous system and we've got our parasympathetic nervous system, right? Those are the two parts of our autonomic nervous system. Autonomic is automatic, right? You don't have any control over your sympathetic or parasympathetic because both of them are autonomic, right? So your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight nervous system, right? That's the nervous system that goes, whoa, holy crap, scary, ugh, get in fight mode, right? That's your sympathetic nervous system. But then you have your parasympathetic nervous system, which is like, relax, it's fine, everything is chill, you know, like let's just, you know what, let's digest that burger that we brought in earlier, have a good time, you know, like that's your parasympathetic nervous system. And that's why you've got, they call it your fight or flight system and your rest and digest system. Like one of them is like, let's go to bed, and the other one is like, let's fight bears, you know, like they're two totally different parts and they're autonomic. So as you start exercising, what will happen is your sympathetic systems, and they're called postganglionic, your ganglia is a part of your brain. We can just leave it at that. So it's the bottom part of this one section of your brain, the postganglionic fibers. Those fibers will release a hormone called noradrenaline. Okay, noradrenaline might sound a little bit familiar, by the way. It's basically, we can just call it adrenaline. Another version of this is what's called norepinephrine, and epinephrine is like a precursor to adrenaline. There's actually, if you've ever heard of like, if you've ever had like seen an EpiPen, right? What that is that's an injection of epinephrine. And so like it's like an adrenaline thing when you are going into like, if you're experiencing like inflammation due to like getting stung by like a bee or something, and you are allergic to bees, you know, all of your blood vessels start to close up in sort of response to that allergic reaction. So what you do to somebody is you inject them with adrenaline, and what that does is their body goes, wow, we must be exercising, and so all your blood vessels go like that, and that opens them up, and that's why it kind of saves somebody's life. I always think of Pulp Fiction. I talk about this every time I teach this slide. But the scene in Pulp Fiction where like you know, her heart stops, and like they take that giant needle and like shoves it in Uma Thurman's chest, and she's like, "Wah!" That's a shot of adrenaline.
I hate that part. I literally hate that part.
Oh, I know, right? Yeah, I hate needles too. Like, they make me real. I'm like really squeamish around needles, but that scene is great. My love for movies outweighs my like distaste for needles. A better version, another like movie scene that has to do with like adrenaline is this dumb movie called Crash. Have you ever seen that with Jason Statham? Is it Crash?
I thought it was called Crank.
Crank, yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that movie is so silly. But my favorite scene in that whole movie, you know, he's trying to keep his heart rate up the whole time. Like his heart rate goes down, he'll die, and that's the plot of the movie. So he like goes to a hospital. He talks to his doctor friend on a cell phone. He's like, "How much of this adrenaline stuff should I inject?" He's like, "Oh, I don't know. We try to find this much," and he had already injected it, and it was like 10 times the amount he was supposed to use. And you see him like he's in an elevator, and he's like, oh no. Like he has this like moment where you're gonna realize his body's like amping up, and then like the elevator opens and you just see him go, whoa! Like, and that scene is so funny. Like the volume of like his voice rushing past, like the first time I saw that I had to like pause the movie. I was like crying. I was laughing so hard. Anyway, that is what noradrenaline. So what will happen is a sympathetic part of your brain, a part that you don't have control over, will release noradrenaline. And what that will do is that will travel down your heart to this other component of your heart here, which we're going to mention in just a second, which is called your sinoatrial node. It's more commonly known as your SA node. And the sinoatrial node is what we refer to as the pacemaker of the heart. Your sinoatrial node is in charge of telling your heart when to fire, right? And so when noradrenaline runs past that fiber and it runs past the SA node, your heart starts to speed up. And that is how it goes faster and faster and faster. Let's go ahead and actually look at that node there. For the record, like the other components here is noradrenaline will also increase what we call your conduction velocity. So there is another node inside of your heart called your atrioventricular node. That's your AV node. And there's also all these things called Purkinje fibers. And I'll pull up pictures of that actually. Purkinje system. I always spell it wrong. Great. There we go. So here's, nope. There we go. So here is that SA node, right? So what'll happen is like your brain will release a little bit of adrenaline, which will run down and it'll run past this SA node. The SA node will say it needs to speed up. Now there is like a little AV node here. This actually delays the signal. Like this is in charge of making the signal. This is in charge of like delaying it. And that's what allows the upper part of your heart, right, those atriums, to contract before the lower part of your heart, which is all of the where the ventricles are located. So when you look at the heart beating, let's see here, heart beat GIF. I'm gonna find the actual heartbeat. So when you look at the way your heart beats, you'll notice it kind of goes from high to low, right? Boy, that is disturbing. We'll go ahead and click off of that. But it goes from like high contractions down to low contractions. That's why you have this little AV node here. So this will initiate the signal, and then this will delay it for a second, and then the signal will continue traveling down. And we want to make sure that it hits all of the fibers of the heart. So it travels throughout this Purkinje system here, right? And then this is one of my favorite names, this little bundle right here where it starts to split. That is called the bundle of His. Which I think sounds like a sci-fi ship's name, like something that Star Trek would battle or something. But then it'll travel throughout all those Purkinje fibers, and those Purkinje fibers are what zap all of the fibers of the heart. So adrenaline will travel down, hit your SA node, travel to the AV node, get delayed for just a second. Once this contraction's done up top, it'll then move to all of this, and that will travel throughout the entire fibers of the heart. So the SA node is in charge of like initiating that signal. So if we look at like heart signals here, right? It's going to start with the sinoatrial node, or SA node, as it's more commonly referred to as. This is the pacemaker of the heart, right? It's in charge of initiating that signal. And the SA node, what it will do, like I said, is it will respond to chemicals throughout the body, particularly noradrenaline, right, or adrenaline, which will speed up the SA node and therefore speed up the heart. Okay, so anytime adrenaline runs past that SA node, the SA node will start to pick up pace. And that's actually going to be in response to something else that we're going to look at tomorrow, but I'll mention it now. So how does your brain know how to release adrenaline, right? How does it know how to do that? Well, you've also got receptors in your brain. And when lactic acid blood, like literally acidic blood, starts to run past those receptors of the brain, that's when your brain releases materials like noradrenaline into your heart, which will then speed up your heart. So anytime your blood starts to become really acidic, so like you start doing some walking lunges, right? And like that takes ATP production, so then your body starts burning glucose. That glucose results in lactic acid, and now that lactic acid, you know, a lot of it's being used to produce ATP inside like your fibers, right? Like inside the mitochondria. Like the ATP goes into the mitochondria, you produce even more ATP. Wait, I said ATP, I meant lactic acid, sorry. The lactic acid gets produced in the fluid portion of the cell. Lactic acid goes into the mitochondria. Mitochondria spits out ATP. But it also spits out some CO2. And some of that lactic acid leaks. Some of it gets away, right? So now your blood's carrying some lactic acid and it's carrying some CO2. And those two things travel past your brain. And your brain's like tasting all of this, right? It's got these chemical receptors that are tasting the acidity and the contents of your blood. And it goes, whew, man, that is some acidic blood. We need to get some more oxygen down to the legs, right? We must be doing some exercise. So what it'll do is it will then release that adrenaline, which then travels past the SA node, and that starts speeding up your heart. That also picks up your breathing pace as well. And so now you start breathing more, you start pumping your heart more, and that is how we get more oxygen delivered throughout the body. Does that make sense, guys? That'll be summed up again. That'll be summed up again tomorrow as well when we get to the neuromuscular system, because we got to talk about the brain. All right, so that's your SA node. Then you get the AV node, atrioventricular node, or AV node, and this will responsible for delaying the signal that comes from the SA node, so that the different fibers of the heart can contract at different times. Okay, and then you have all of your Purkinje, I do it every time with an E, Purkinje fibers, right? And these are various fibers running throughout the heart that allow all heart cells to contract. Okay, so your Purkinje fibers run throughout the heart to actually zap those fibers and create that contraction. But it all starts with that SA node. So again, here's your heart, right? Here's all the different components. You've got your different chambers here, and then that's going to travel down, and then that will get pumped. This is kind of a weird chart because you can see they really wanted to put an emphasis on like the tubes, which most drawings of the heart don't do. So don't think that this is a chamber, this is a chamber. That's not what that is. This is just the aorta, which is attached to the left ventricle, and this is a pulmonary artery, which is attached to that right ventricle. I hate this photo. I think it's really confusing for new students. Also, this valve is kind of high up. It's a little bit more down here. Anyway, So that's sort of the anatomy of our heart. How are we feeling about the anatomy of the heart, guys? Do you have any questions about any of that?
No, just.
All right. All right.
No.
Let's go. Cool.
Nothing.
Let's go ahead and look at blood vessels, right? So we got to go all the way back to the top of our notes, right? We were on the heart. Now we are on blood vessels. Okay, so blood vessels are a series. Actually, no. There's a really great. Yeah, I remember this definition is really good. It is the systematic circuit of. I'm going to say of tubes, consisting of nearly 60,000 miles of arteries, arterioles. Typing, capillaries, and veins, and venules. Veins and venules. Okay, 60,000 miles. Really quickly, what is the circumference of the Earth? The Earth is only 24,000 miles. So your blood vessels could circle the Earth close to 2.5 times. That is a lot of blood vessels if you were to stretch them all out end to end, which obviously is very difficult to do. But that's because your blood vessels are very small. If you want to see a really great example of all of your blood vessels in the human body, bodies exhibit. They've always got really good pictures of this in like the bodies exhibit if you ever get a chance to go see this kind of stuff. But look at all those blood vessels. It looks like it's tissue, but those are just a series of little tiny tubes, right? And obviously they can't really have all of them there because they're so microscopic, they probably break off. But that's a pretty good representation. By the way, I just saw the lungs up here as well. There's your lungs, by the way, all the bronchi and bronchioles and stuff. Kind of cool. And of course they dyed them blue because we have blue blood. I'm kidding. No, we do not ever. But we do always draw it that way. So these tubes are responsible for the delivery of oxygen throughout your body, right? Like we're really great at gathering oxygen in our lungs, but we got to be able to get that stuff throughout our entire body. And so that's your blood vessel's main job, is to deliver all of that oxygen. But also to like provide a means for like the removal of waste to travel as well. So your blood vessels are responsible for the delivery of oxygen to throughout the body and the removal of CO2 from throughout the body, right? So both, that's what your blood vessels allow your body to do. It gives you a, it gives you a ton of vessels for all of these materials to travel. Okay, so the blood will leave through the left ventricle, right, like we talked about, and then it will travel through your aorta, which is the largest version of an artery inside of your body, and then that will split into different types of arteries throughout the entire body. You can see this is traveling down through your digestive system here, which splits off, and then it travels down to each of your legs and splits off into the various directions that it needs to go, and those are the different arteries traveling throughout your body. The smallest arteries are called arterioles, and then arterioles branch off into what are called capillaries. And capillaries are where the actual exchange site is happening. Capillaries split off smaller and smaller until they form like these little beds, and those beds are where the actual exchange of nutrients is taking place. So we're going to kind of go in order. We're going to go in an order here that is going to kind of like, it's going to look like from order of largest to smallest, and then it's going to get a little bit bigger again. So we're going to track like a single blood cell almost, as if it's like traveling out of the heart, gets to a tissue, and then travels back to the heart. That's kind of the order that we're going to go in here. So let's take a look at that. So we've got arteries, which are your largest blood vessels. Okay, so the arteries are the largest blood vessels. They carry blood away from the heart. Okay, so an artery will always carry blood away from the heart, no matter what type of artery it is. And sometimes this gets just slightly confusing. Sometimes I know that I did this in school. Mostly I had to be, I'm sure I was like absent or something, because I had this misunderstanding for like a really long, like a whole semester. But if you look at like the heart and blood vessels, if you look at your heart and all the blood vessels, right, like arteries carry blood away from the heart. And so like it's easy to make the assumption that an artery would always carry like blood that is super rich in oxygen, right? Because it's an artery and it's going away from the heart, and the heart's job is to pump blood away to get to the various tissues of the body. But do not make that mistake. There is an example of deoxygenated blood carrying arteries, particularly your pulmonary arteries, right? So an artery is defined by its ability to push blood away from the heart, not by whether or not it's got oxygen in it, right? Your right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs, and that is very low oxygenated blood. So when blood is traveling away from the heart through your pulmonary arteries, that is deoxygenated blood. So do not try to memorize arteries and veins by whether or not they have like oxygen in them. Pay attention to like what direction they're traveling in. If it's traveling away from the heart, it's an artery. If it's traveling towards the heart, it's a vein. And that's the rule. Doesn't have anything to do with whether it has oxygen in it or not. So arteries, largest blood vessels, they carry blood away from the heart. The small version of arteries are going to be called arterioles, right? Which are small branches from arteries. Okay, and then you're gonna have capillaries. Okay, capillaries, whoops, are the smallest blood vessels. Actually, you know, we're gonna say microscopic because they are. Microscopic blood vessels that form beds and act as the exchange site of nutrients and other materials, right? So capillaries are actually where like the exchange of nutrients is happening, okay? Then you're going to have your veins, which are blood vessels that are carrying blood back towards the heart, okay? So again, like if arteries are carrying blood away from your heart, veins are carrying blood towards your heart. You do have small versions of arteries, which are called arterioles. You also have small versions of veins, which are called venules, okay, which are small branches that come, small branches, or small, I would show also smaller versions of veins that come together to make up the vein, right? So so if you think of it as like a highway system, right? Again, like traveling down like your main oh my god, I'm forgetting the name of the freaking aorta. Blech. Your aorta, right? That's your main like branch coming right out of your heart. That's like the largest freeway, right? And then that freeway kind of splits into maybe smaller versions of freeways until eventually it might become like a highway, like a 2-lane highway, which is really small. And then that 2-lane highway becomes like a street. That street becomes like a small side street, which eventually becomes like a driveway, you know? And that's where like stuff is being exchanged. Then you would take the exact same style of thing, right? You would take a driveway to a slightly larger side street, and then that side street would form like a larger street, which would then come together to form like maybe a highway, which would come to form like a freeway. And that's again like how your arteries and your veins. You would go, blood would travel through an artery out of the heart, which would then travel down like a specific branch into an arteriole. It would get into smaller and smaller and smaller branches until eventually it is traveling through like small capillary beds, where it will then finally reach a tissue, exchange some nutrients, and then it's got to get back to the heart so that it can drop off that CO2 at the lungs. So then it'll continue traveling through like larger and larger capillaries until eventually it travels through like some venules, and then it'll travel through larger and larger venules until it becomes like a full formed vein, until eventually that vein will drop into the heart and it will then get pumped back through arteries again to the lungs. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, one special thing about veins that we do have to mention, your veins do have special valves on them. Veins will contain special valves that prevent blood from backflowing. So you do have special little valves. These are sometimes called, like, they're an example of a sphincter, right? So there's also precapillary sphincters that are actually in like your small, really tiny blood vessels. And these are like circular little, like, you know, sphincters that squeeze down like that. And they contract in order to like close off blood flow. So like this is how your body like controls blood flow to specific muscles that need it. So if a muscle is like more metabolically active, the precapillary sphincters will open up and that will promote more blood flow to that area. This is what happens if you ever get like a, you know, like if you ever sprain something or damage something or pull a muscle, right? Like what's happening is like there's a bunch of blood flow going to that area because your body wants to deliver nutrients to that area. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that blood pools and then, you know, can't deliver any more nutrients, but it's close to doing a good job.
That happened to me this weekend.
Oh no, what happened?
I was skateboarding with sandals and I stubbed my toe and it is black.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's so bad. It looks so nasty.
There has never been a good I was skateboarding in sandals story.
Yeah.
Because it's like, just well, like
I'll never do that again.
Yeah. Dude, I had a friend who was like going downhill. We were skateboarding and he was going downhill and he was in flip-flops and it was like through this small tunnel and he got it started going so fast he got really scared and he was afraid he was going to bail and then he was going to like land on the ground, but the flip-flops weren't going to be able to handle it. So as he was like picking up more and more speed, he was just like, I just got to get off this thing. So he just jumped off, but like he waited too long. And so when he jumped, he just hit this concrete wall. It was like a cartoon. Like he was like traveling and he jumped and he just forward momentum right into this like concrete wall. And we had to take him to the hospital. He was crazy. And I was like, oh. Yeah, so that's how your body like controls blood flow is like these little sphincters. So like if you're doing a lot of activity in a certain muscle, those sphincters will open up and that will promote more blood flow so you can deliver more oxygen and do more work. Meanwhile, like your body is going to go, okay, well, we're not really using this tissue, so we'll prevent blood flow in order to do that as well. And that's what's kind of cool about your nervous system. Your nervous system actually knows when you like what types of tissues you're using, so it actually like shuts down any tissues that are unimportant. This happens to your brain, by the way. This is part of the reason why, and they've done studies on this where they've given people like logic and IQ tests after working out. So for the record, regular activity and regular exercise has actually been shown to increase like emotional and like logical intelligences and all this stuff, especially if you do it like when you're young. So like working out is great. It makes your body healthy. It also like helps with intelligence. However, in like this like window, and I'm not sure how long the window is because this isn't really my area, but like if there is this window after you are done working out where you are just a little bit dumber. And it's because your brain has shut down in order to allow blood to travel to all your muscles, which you were using. And my favorite example of this is literally after like a super heavy powerlifting day. I remember literally walking out of the gym just being like, man, that was like a tough workout. And running into a girl I was dating and I didn't recognize her. Like my brain was like, I know this is somebody that I know, but I don't have the mental capacity to understand who it is. Oh my God, it's my girlfriend. And I had like a big freak out moment internally. But that is like an example of like your blood flow to your brain even shuts down because like blood flow needs to go elsewhere. So your body is able to actually kind of control that. All right, so finishing up, we also have special blood vessels here. The one particular ones that we want to mention, and they are just examples of blood vessels, but they're going to kind of get their own sort of section here. We do have your coronary arteries. You also have coronary veins as well. And so coronary arteries are arteries that are responsible for providing the heart itself with blood, right? So coronary artery disease is obviously a very, very common disease in the world. But if we look at your coronary arteries, you know, they are on the same circuit, right? They do actually travel, you know, you can see blood would travel up the aorta, right? Well, you can see there's branches from the aorta that come down and then they cover the heart itself. So those are your coronary arteries. Yeah, thank you. Whew. And then you can see like there's even an even better picture. You can see like how it's like really branching, you know, all over. And there's coronary veins as well, which are going to travel back and supply the heart itself or remove waste from the heart. But those coronary arteries, you know, they're the artery. All blood vessels are responsible for supplying oxygen and nutrients to the tissues of the body. But these are the tissues, these are the vessels that supply the tissues that are the pump that supply the rest of the body. That's why they're so important, right? Like these are well, the reason we talk about coronary arteries so often is because like they're the arteries that are responsible for keeping the tissue alive. That is the tissue that keeps the body alive. You know, like these are your most important arteries. So coronary blood flow is hugely important here, right? And so they're the these are the arteries responsible for providing the heart itself with blood. And the function of your heart depends on its ability to have enough blood flow in order to like increase or decrease depending on like, you know, what type of activity you're doing. So obviously hugely important there. So you've got your right coronary artery, and that supplies like blood to the right side of the heart, and you get your left coronary artery, which supplies blood to the left side of the heart. And that's really kind of what we're looking at there. So if we go back and we talk about like, you know, looking at like all of this signal here, right? And you can see, right, we can kind of track like blood flow here. The top of the heart is going to contract first and the bottom of the heart is going to contract second. So each cycle, we kind of already talked about this a little bit, but each cycle is going to begin with your SA node initiating a signal, right? So then that action potential, that electric signal, will then travel to the AV node where it'll be slightly delayed. So that allows the top of the heart to finish contracting. Then after that delay is over, it will run down and contract the rest of the heart, which you can see like is actually hitting like there's way more coverage here, particularly in that left ventricle side, because all of these fibers, this really muscular side of the heart, again, that's got to pump blood over super long distances. So we want to have more electricity on this side, zapping more fibers. And so that impulse will then continue to the bundle of His, which is right here, where it will split, and then eventually travel to your Purkinje fibers, where it'll zap all of the fibers of the heart. So you do have the ability to kind of match how much your heart is beating to like your oxygen levels content. So when we're looking at that, compared to skeletal muscle, about 40% of your cell volume of your cardiac muscles is actually made up of mitochondria. So this is kind of crazy, right? Like if we think of like our heart cells and we think of like, you know, the more mitochondria a muscle cell has, the more likely we are to classify that muscle as a type 1 muscle fiber, right? Mitochondria is how we produce, you know, long-term energy, right? That's our endurance type of energy production. So when you think about like your coronary arteries delivering so much oxygen to the heart itself, 40% of your heart's cells are made up of mitochondria. That is the most mitochondria. That is the highest mitochondrial density you will find in any tissue in the body. That is a huge amount. So your heart eats oxygen like crazy compared to any other tissue. Metabolically, it is a super high metabolism type of tissue. And so it is eating oxygen like nuts. So obviously the more work your heart is doing, the more oxygen it needs to deliver. And that's where like there is a connection between like your brain, your heart, and your diaphragm. That's what allows you to like breathe more. That's what allows your heart to pump faster. And all of that is to like obviously supply your entire body with oxygen. But its first stop is the heart itself. And that's where it's delivering more and more and more oxygen. So the lower your heart rate is at rest, that's a way that we know that is what an efficient heart is. Like one of the ways that we define like fitness is by looking at somebody who has a lower resting heart rate. If your heart doesn't feel that it needs to pump as often, obviously it's getting plenty of oxygen flow, which means it's getting the same amount of like work done, but with less beats. So that's a strong heart, right? Like if you were measuring my power output, we would measure like, let's say like I would do like a forward squat jump, like a frog jump or something, right? I would take my arms down and I would do a forward leap as far as I can, right? So that's one way to like measure output. You would just measure like how far I traveled, right? And that's pretty good. So now let's say like you wanted to do that, but you're gonna give me 100 meters distance to travel, right? So I'm gonna travel 100 meters, but I have to travel that 100 meters by jumping. So let's say that takes me, 25 jumps. I have no idea how long it would actually be. Hopefully that's hopefully that's not an embarrassingly high number. But if it took me 25 jumps to travel 100 meters, right? That's my power output. It takes 25 over 100. But then let's say somebody else, right? Like let's say DK Metcalf, my current favorite football player, let's say he comes over and he decides to jump it, and he does it in like 15 jumps, crazy, super powerful guy, right? We know that he got it done in less jumps. He was able to do it in a much more efficient way than I was able to do it. He is a much like more powerful jump. Same concept in your heart. If you've got to push 100 milliliters of blood, right? Similar to how I had to jump 100 meters, and it takes you 3 beats to do it versus 1 beat, right? That's a much less efficient heart. So that's why heart rate is a way that we measure the function of the heart, right? And like I said earlier, all of this is under control of your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system. This is the part of the autonomic nervous system responsible for increasing your heart rate and increasing that ventricular contraction, amongst like obviously other physiologic things that are happening as well. Okay, so that's all of our main anatomy here. So we've kind of started to pivot into, let's talk about like the function of the heart. Let's go, yeah, there we go. Calculating the functionality, what do they say? Calculating the work of the heart, that's much better. Oxygen consumption, right, is obviously a big part of this. Oxygen consumption of your myocardium, the muscular part of the heart, is at rest is higher than in skeletal muscle, right? And we know that because we know there's a lot more mitochondria in your muscle, in your heart muscle, right? So obviously it's going to consume more oxygen. So because of that, it's critical that we have like that whenever we have like mental or physical stress, like our cardiovascular system can increase in order to supply more oxygen to the system there, right? So like we have to have the ability to increase our oxygen consumption in response to higher levels of stress. So we actually call that your myocardial oxygen consumption. That's the volume of oxygen that your heart is like eating in order to do its work, right? And we can estimate this. We can estimate it by knowing your heart rate times your blood's pressure. So we're gonna have a term for that. We're gonna call that your cardiac output, okay? And we'll look at that in just a second here. But cardiac output, and they're kind of defining this slightly differently, but we're gonna use the versions that's like found in your textbook. This is how, this is the overall performance of the heart, okay? It is made up of the heart rate, so the number of beats per minute, and the stroke volume, the volume of blood ejected from the heart per beat. Okay, so that is your cardiac output, right? It can be estimated by your heart rate times your systolic blood pressure. Now, obviously, it's really, really, really difficult for us to be able to measure someone's systolic blood pressure like in the middle of working out, right? Like that's a very difficult thing for us to measure. You know, that's something that you want to be able to like kind of let somebody relax for. But it's very easy for us to estimate because we know the formula for these two things is cardiac output, which is going to be listed as Q because it's a quotient, equals heart rate, or HR, times stroke volume, or SV, right? So that's our formula. Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So because this is times and not plus, we know that like if this is struggling, if stroke volume is not doing well, this has to pick up the equation, right? Because here's the thing. I'm no math teacher, and so I'm probably going to butcher this example. But like it's kind of like algebra. If you need to get to the number 100, right? Like we need to reach the number 100. One of the easiest ways to would be 10 times 10, right? That's pretty easy. But let's say you just can't get 10 out of that second number. So if we had like 10 heart rates and 10 stroke volumes, that would give us a cardiac output of 100, right? But if we just don't have a good stroke volume, like our heart is weak, our heart just doesn't have the ability to contract. And so now this is 5, right? So now we are stuck with the number 5. We have to change this number so that we can still reach the number 100. So we now have to change this number to 20. This has to beat twice as fast in order to make up for a weak heart. And that's why we use heart rate to measure, you know, the efficiency of someone's heart. That's why we monitor it while we're exercising regularly. That's why we look at this. We know that it's related to the overall performance of the heart. A lower resting heart rate indicates to me that your heart's pumping plenty of blood by doing it less often. Make sense? Did the algebra example help? Good God. It's like, Brad, are you willingly and knowingly going into math? We know this is not your strong point. So there's actually a guy who discovered that. Oh, no, I can't remember his first name. Crap. It's like Johann or something. Anyway, it's called the Fick principle. And the Fick principle is a principle that is used to calculate your cardiac output as the quotient of total body oxygen consumption divided by the difference in oxygen content in arterial blood. And what it states is that if your stroke volume is low, your heart rate must be high. That's basically the Fick principle in a nutshell, right? So if the stroke volume is low, the heart rate must be high, right? So the higher, therefore, the higher the resting heart rate, the less efficient the heart. Okay, that's what the Fick principle is basically saying in a nutshell. So all of this is regulated, right? All of this is regulated by that SA node. The sinoatrial node, like I said, pacemaker of the heart, it's determining this. And generally, your SA node is going to beat about 70 times per minute. It's actually an average of like 70 to 80 beats per minute for men and women. So we'll put that down here, right? And actually, you know what? Just for the sake of it, because I know we do have a new student here too, I am going to put these two definitions here. So heart rate is the number of beats in 1 minute. Stroke volume is going to be the amount of blood ejected from the heart. I should have put that up there earlier. I mean, I guess I kind of did, but yeah, let's give these definitions. So that is the average resting heart rate, right? Average heart rate for most individuals. I know it says 70 beats here, but it's about 70 to 80 beats per minute, actually. On average, it's about 70 for men and about 80 for women. Women's bodies a little bit smaller, therefore like smaller blood vessels, therefore an ever so slightly higher beat. Doesn't mean it's actually less efficient than like a heart that's beating less. It's literally, in this case, it's just like a physics thing. It's also why like the smaller and smaller animals that you see, you'll see like higher heart rates and stuff. It's always surprising, like cats are like the most relaxing animal in the world, but like if you ever listen to their heart rate, it sounds like it's going a million miles an hour. There is a term for like when your heart is going super fast or going super slow. We're not worried about it, but it is called either bradycardia, which is your heart rate going super slow. And then you have tachycardia, which is when your heart is going super fast, if your heart is racing. And both, you know, there's a lot of things that can kind of kick those off. But basically, when there's a need for more oxygen, you know, again, those receptors, those chemoreceptors, they're chemical receptors in your brain are going, man, that is some acidic ass blood. We need to pump the heart more, right? So it'll then pick up your pace, and then that is going to deliver more oxygen to counteract that CO2 and counteract that lactic acid, right? And so that is going to be accomplished by your sympathetic nervous system and its influence on the SA and AV nodes. Whoops. You do also have pulse pressure, aka like blood pressure, right? And this is like the amount of pressure that you have within your heart. So blood pressure is going to be the pressure that is pressing on the inside of blood vessels during a heart's contraction, okay? So that is your blood pressure. And this is going to be made up of two different versions. It is going to be made up of systolic pressure, which is going to be known as systole. And this occurs during the contraction of the heart. It is the pressure pushing on arterial. Actually, that's actually the definition. Whoops. Let's erase that. The pressure pushing on the wall, the arterial walls during a heart's contraction. That's much better. So when your heart contracts, that is systole, right? Typically 120, right? And then we have your diastolic pressure, which is known as diastole. And that is the pressure pushing on the arterial walls during a heart's relaxation. So this is the relaxing part, right? And that is typically 80, right? So that's the 120/80 that we're describing when we describe blood pressure, right? And so there's also another law here, and it's called the Frank-Starling law, and it states that like your stroke volume of the heart will increase in response to blood filling the heart. So like when the heart starts to fill with more and more blood, your stroke volume is going to increase. Your blood pressure, the amount of blood ejected from the heart each time, will increase in response to like more blood flow, right? And that more blood flow, again, is determined by your nervous system. And here's where all that's happening, by the way. Like here's the, you know, cardiac center of your brain, right? This is like what we were talking about earlier. This is that post-ganglionic fibers. So then that will travel down. Here is one of your, this is your spinal cord here. So you can see here's a spinal disc. And then that will travel down to another spinal disc till it eventually gets to like where it needs to go. And it'll travel over to here and zap that SA node, which will then delay its signal over at the AV node, which will then travel throughout and squeeze the heart. And there are all of these little chemical receptors inside here that are sensing it. There's also chemical receptors on the way up to the brain, actually. This is kind of fun, kind of a fun little fact. You've also got some little chemical receptors on like the stuff that the heart is pumping. And then that is attached to like your nervous system as well. So you've got some chemical receptors actually on those arteries as it's traveling like up to your brain. It's not always like directly at the brain itself. And that way, it's able to kind of get the signal a little bit quicker. So that's all well and good. Finally, let's talk about how to train our freaking heart rate a little bit, shall we? We have anatomy the crap out of this today. We've physiology the heck out of it. Let's talk about like how we as trainers can make a weak heart into a strong one, right? So obviously at rest and at maximal exercise, you are going to be very much using your aerobic energy system, right? Aerobic exercise will increase that parasympathetic activity and therefore will actually decrease the intrinsic rate of your SA node. Again, big complicated sentence, but what we're saying here is that when you actually train cardio, when you do cardiovascular exercise, it decreases your parasympathetic activity. Remember, your parasympathetic nervous system, it increases your parasympathetic activity by decreasing your sympathetic activity. So remember, your sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight, right? So that's panicking. When you start doing cardio, the reason it's so uncomfortable is because your body is like, are we running away from like a wild animal? Like, what's going on here? Are we stressed? Are we stressed? I think we're stressed. Are we stressed? You know, your body's freaking out, right? But the more you continually do that, the more your body starts to adapt, and you know, your parasympathetic nervous system starts to realize like, hey, this is fine. Like, we like cardio. This feels good, right? And somebody, I'm sure you guys in the, like some of you who might dislike, right? Like cardio is either your favorite or least favorite thing. So I'm sure somebody's like, yeah, sure, it feels good. But it does. Like the more you do it, right? The reason like people get addicted to exercise is because their sympathetic nervous system actually decreases. This is why exercise reduces our stress. Your parasympathetic nervous system starts to help you realize that exercise and activity are good things. They're relaxing. This is how like you can meditate and get all your positive and negative thoughts like laid out, you know, and focus on the good stuff. Like it is directly like a physiologic response. It's why people feel better when they exercise. I love that because like you can literally track like positive emotions with this like very physical thing. So aerobic exercise will increase the parasympathetic activity, right? That's the calming down, that's the rest and digest activity, which will therefore decrease your SA node and slow it down. And so when you start doing cardio, your heart doesn't feel like it needs to go, activity. You know, it doesn't feel like it needs to freak out. It's like, okay, we're easing in. This is fine. We're gonna increase it because we need to be able to deliver oxygen, but we don't have to go crazy, right? And therefore, it doesn't have to make stress hormones. That adaptation is how you can have a lower heart rate during actual activity. Now, I'll tell you one thing. Like, I've been in the long distance running community for years now. I like long distance running. You know, I'm a big fan. And I've never experienced this personally, but I have friends, a few friends who have stories of how they are actually so relaxed when they go for a run, they will actually doze off. They can get so relaxed during like a long, if it's like a really sub-maximal run and they're not really like trying to push their body, they're just going out for a run just for the enjoyment of it. I've had friends, multiple friends, describe like they will literally just kind of doze off for a second. Their body will keep jogging and keep them upright. Their muscle memory will just kind of take over. And then like they'll kind of wake up. The closest I have ever gotten to this is when I was doing a half marathon and I had like an allergic reaction to the shirt that they gave. So I like put the shirt on and like I don't have allergies, but I don't know what happened, but I broke out in hives and I was like, holy crap. And so I had a friend of mine who was not in the race run over to like a Ralph's. And I was like, get me some Benadryl. And so they like brought me Benadryl and I popped a few, which Benadryl makes you real sleepy. And like, sure enough, like mid run, you know, I was like staying with my friends and it wasn't like a very serious race. So I was just out there jogging and I like dozed off, but like my body did not keep running. My body like fell asleep and I veered off and I like bounced off this car and I was like, where am I? Oh God, right. And I kept running. That's the closest I've ever gotten to like my parasympathetic nervous system actually calming me all the way down. But that is literally how relaxed you can get during running. You should look up some other interesting stories. There's even crazier versions of that same thing. But endurance athletes can actually create a cardiovascular difference between like their trained version and like their untrained version, right? Like they can be more at rest than somebody who is actually at rest during training. There are a couple of like physiologic differences that occur here, primarily in like a trained person. You know, blood is going to be, they're going to be pumping like more blood per heartbeat. Their heart is so strong that it's able to get more work done and it doesn't actually have to elevate as much. Now, there is also something that is called your PO2. This is the partial pressure of oxygen, and that's the pressure of how much oxygen is actually being dissolved and being able to move into and out of your lungs with your blood, right? So when we're measuring like PO2 levels, we are measuring like how effectively your blood is moving oxygen molecules into and out of like your cells' tissues. And that's going to be determined by things like your hemoglobin levels. So if your PO2 levels, if you have like plenty of pressure, it means that you're carrying lots of oxygen molecules per blood cell, right? And so like developing more hemoglobin by doing more cardio exercise allows you to deliver more oxygen in less work, right? So at rest, a large percentage of your cardiac output is actually going to your digestive system. I thought we were getting into the training. I forgot, like we are getting into it, but it's starting like resting first. So when you're resting, most of your blood's like going to your digestive system. You know, like the whole point of like resting is to like process nutrients and things like that. And so like most of it is doing that, right? But as you continue doing more and more work, like the greater the level of activity, your body's going to start producing more blood flow, and it's going to shut down blood flow to your digestive system and increase blood flow to whatever types of like metabolic tissues you're using. So if you're doing like leg exercise, the blood flow to your legs is going to increase. If you're doing upper body exercise, the blood flow to your upper body is going to increase. And so that's where like the idea of like performing like peripheral heart action activity is so good for training your blood vessels, right? Like if I do a bunch of upper body work, the blood vessels in my upper body are going to increase in size, and therefore I'm going to get more blood flow to my upper body. If I do more lower body work afterwards, now the blood vessels in my lower body are going to increase, and I'm going to get more blood flow to my lower body. So if I alternate between upper body, lower body, upper body, lower body, if I go back and forth between those two, my blood is actually being shunted into different directions. And that is going to, like, it's like doing repetitions for your blood vessels. And that helps with like blood pressure. And that's why peripheral heart action workouts are so important to do with clients who have hypertension. During activity, let's go ahead and actually really quickly, I do want to put, there's very little information on blood in here because we talked so much about blood yesterday, but I do really quickly want to just address blood so that we have, we've got our heart, blood, and blood vessels. So really quickly, like let's just get blood out of the way here. Is that where I'm at? No, I'm one more forward. Oh shoot, I should have put it up here. All right, hold on. I'm going to add a small note up here. Just, I know this is kind of like disorganized, but I do want to put, I should have done this earlier. So blood acts as a medium through which to transport nutrients and wastes. Okay, we'll leave it at that. So now we've got all three of the components there. All right, let's go ahead and look at like training the heart. So we know in particular that like cardiovascular exercise will increase the heart's efficiency by primarily focusing on the development of type 1 muscle fibers, right? Which are type 1 fibers are metabolically reliant on mitochondria and oxygen, right? So when we train for more like type 1 fibers, that's one of the best ways to strengthen our heart. By doing high duration, low intensity exercise, it strengthens our heart. Now, I'm not saying that's the only type of like fiber that you want to focus on, right? Like that's certainly not true. You know, you don't only want to focus on type 1 muscle fibers, you also want to focus on type 2 muscle fibers. But when it comes to training your heart, training for type 1 fibers in particular is one of the best ways to do that because they are metabolically relying on oxygen delivery. And so because they rely on oxygen delivery and your heart is what determines your oxygen delivery, you are training your heart as sort of a byproduct of doing this activity. So by doing high repetitions, you're strengthening your cardiovascular system as a byproduct because your cardiovascular system is going, man, that is some like oxygen hungry tissue down there. I need to just keep working this whole time. I'm not going to slow down. And so it starts to strengthen itself. What are type 1 fibers? I do want to kind of break that down just a little bit here real quick. So actually, let's put that here actually. Type 1 muscle fibers are muscle fibers. Whoa, what happened to my font size? Muscle fibers that contain a large quantity of mitochondria and oxidative enzymes. So remember your mitochondria, right? That's where you're producing most of the ATP whenever you are doing like aerobic activity. Well, we also got to remember that like what kicks off metabolism are enzymes. Remember, enzymes are responsible for creating like the, allowing metabolism to take place, right? Like a chemical reaction is going to occur between two things that are going to chemically react, but enzymes are really good at sort of kicking that reaction off. And so you're going to have more enzymes in type 1 fibers. This is why, by the way, like, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but Maggie, you were just talking about doing cardio, right? Earlier this morning. But if you've ever taken like a week or 2 weeks off of like activity and come back into the gym, it just feels so much harder that first week back. And the reason for that is you haven't lost, and it feels like you've lost muscle, right? It's like, oh man, this is harder because I must have like gotten weaker over time. That's actually not necessarily true. Your muscle fiber size might not have decreased at all. Your muscles are still there. Your nervous system still knows how to control your muscles. Like for the most part, you're fine. But the one thing that does die really quickly are your enzymes. They are just very short-lived. They just aren't the type of like material that lasts very long in your body. And so you're continually replacing them whenever you do more oxidative work. But, those enzymes that you had died off of old age, and you didn't make any new ones to replace them because you haven't been doing your cardio, because you went to the Bahamas for the weekend, like you took a little bit of time off. Or maybe you were quarantined in your freaking house, and that's why that feels so hard. It's a loss of those oxidative enzymes. So most of the ATP comes from cellular respiration, which is an oxidation reduction reaction, aka something that is kicked off by enzymes. Type 1, right? And so through extended durations of oxidative metabolism, the body will create more oxidative enzymes in response. This is why you also get better at cardio faster than any other type of activity. I know people hate cardio, but like it's the thing that gets better the fastest. Like gaining strength and increasing your 1 rep max takes kind of a long time to occur. You get slow gains over a very long period of time. Like you go up 5 pounds and you feel like really triumphant. It doesn't come that quickly. But your cardio actually increases pretty quick. Obviously, everybody's going to be a little bit different in how that improves. Like if you are genetically designed to be very much like a type 1 person, you're going to experience Type 1 gains faster. You're going to get better at cardio faster than somebody who is more of a type 2 person. And that is where we sort of get into those body types that you've probably seen people talk about before, the difference between like an ectomorph and an endomorph and a mesomorph, you know? Yeah, there are certain like things locked in our DNA that kind of determine like your overall like predisposition for a body type. You know, like I come from a tribe of runners for sure. It's a reason why I like cardio so much. I've got long, skinny limbs, you know, I tend to have more of an ectomorph's body. But that doesn't mean that like through training, I can't like develop other versions of that, right? It's just something that I have a predisposition for. So there is no reason to put too much of an emphasis on like what you were born with versus like what you can train for, you know? Yeah, you're going to be gifted in one way or another. Doesn't mean that your body's not going to adapt. You still have all the tools necessary to develop your body however you want it to. And I think that that is super motivating, you know? Like you talk to somebody who's like, oh, I've been heavy my whole life. I'm just never going to lose weight. And it's like, you know, this is my body type. Everybody in my family is heavy. And they kind of, it dejects you. It kind of puts you in this place where it's like, it is what it is and I can't change. It's like, no, your body is very, very adaptable. It's just, yeah, you were not gifted with a lot of these oxidative enzymes. Doesn't mean you can't develop them, you know? We're moving into like psychology a little bit, but I had a deep conversation with somebody just a couple of days ago where I was like, you know, get over that mentality. So when we are looking at like your VO2 max, right? When we're looking at like your volume of oxygen consumed, right? That is what we call your VO2 max. So there is a term that we call this, right? So the volume VO2 max, right? This is going to be the maximal volume of oxygen consumed by the body, or more specifically, your body's cells, right? So whenever you start exercising, we know that your body is going to consume oxygen in order to produce ATP. So the exercise protocol involves a specific increasing of the intensity while your VO2 is measured. So what you're going to do is you're going to measure the volume of oxygen someone is consuming during activity. The more oxygen they can consume, the more energy they are outputting, the more ATP they're producing. So one of the ways that we can measure someone's cardiovascular efficiency and like how strong their cardiovascular system is we can measure their VO2. If you have a capacity to consume more oxygen, if you have a capacity to consume like more oxygen than you did in the past, you are now better at producing ATP. Your muscles are more metabolically hungry. You are having a greater output of energy. And so VO2 max is a great way to measure like, you know, how fit somebody is. However, it is a little technical to do, so it can be kind of difficult to perform sometimes. You know, you need very specialized equipment. So a lot of times we have formulas to estimate someone's VO2 max instead. And that's where we come to like things like the Rockport walk test and other physiologic assessments. So with a change in intensity, obviously there's going to be an increase in VO2, right? So as intensity climbs, the volume of oxygen consumed will also climb, right? But obviously, if you cannot, you know, do any more work, if you're tapped out, well, you can't consume any more oxygen. So there is like a linear relationship there. So let's go ahead and break this down a little bit. If I remember right, I got to do a little bit of a sneaky note taking because they don't do a great job of this next part. Hold on, I'm going to peek forward just a second here. Yeah, okay, let's get a couple more slides first. So close to the end of an exercise test, right? Let's say you do like a VO2 test. There's gonna be a point at which you cannot consume any more oxygen. So you're gonna plateau, right? Like you're doing activity, you're consuming more oxygen, and then eventually it's gonna plateau out. That is your VO2 max, right? That's the plateau. It's the maximal amount of oxygen that you can consume. So let's take a look really quick at this. I wanna show you what a VO2 max test kind of looks like. All right.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Gandler. I'm the sport biomechanist here at the Memorial Hermann Ironman Sports Medicine Institute. VO2 max test is a test to determine your body's maximal consumption of oxygen and the efficiency of your muscles. To do this test, our goal is to get you to max exercise to determine your heart rate max, your VO2 max, and an estimated lactate threshold. During the test, we're measuring oxygen consumption and CO2 production to determine all these values. And from that, you can help set your heart rate training zones. The best way to use this is as a change over time measure to determine how your workout plan is going, if you're getting better, whether that's running, CrossFit, any sort of cardio-based exercise. The protocol for this test is we choose a speed where you're comfortable, but not too comfortable. And every minute, we're going to increase the incline on the treadmill. Our goal is
okay. So really quickly, I'm just going to go back just a little bit. So this right here, the way this mask works is it is measuring the exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide. So this machine knows how much oxygen is coming in, and it knows how much CO2 is coming out. So we call that a respiratory exchange ratio, right? It's literally like I'm trading you oxygen, you're giving me CO2, right? And so like if I give you 10 oxygen and you give me 4 oxygen back and 6 CO2, right? My respiratory exchange ratio is 0.6, which is actually impossible. It never goes below 0.7. We always consume at least 70%. Bad example. But if I gave you 7, and if I gave you 10 and you gave me 7 back with 3 oxygen and like 3 oxygen back, but 7 CO2, most of that CO2 is, or most of that oxygen is getting burnt up. But that 0.7 number, that is when you are like perfectly at rest. So again, if 10 oxygen comes in and 7 CO2 come out, the machine's measuring that. And so they would assume she's sleeping. That would be a respiratory exchange ratio of 0.7. Now, as she begins doing more and more and more and more work, right, the same amount of oxygen's coming in. I mean, obviously more oxygen molecules are going in. She's going to start breathing harder, but the ratio of how much oxygen is coming in and oxygen's coming out, like that's still relatively the same. Like, you know, as she continues doing more work, the ratio is going to start to get like smaller and smaller and smaller. She's going to consume more of that oxygen until she hits a point where I don't know how many units are going in. We'll say 100 units of oxygen go in and 100 units of CO2 come out. She is no longer exhaling any oxygen. And what we know that means is that her body is consuming all of it, right? All of the oxygen going in is getting used up. So she has hit what is called her lactate threshold. Because here's the other thing, right? Why is her body consuming that oxygen? Well, it's consuming it in response to how much lactic acid she's producing, right? Her cells are producing energy, and her body is taking that lactic acid and converting it into ATP. But it needs oxygen in order to do that. So it's consuming it, right? So when she's at rest, only, you know, a good chunk of it's getting consumed, but some of it's not. And then as she continues going higher and higher and higher, she's producing more lactic acid. So her body's going, okay, I need to consume more oxygen. Until eventually she's producing so much lactic acid, but she's tapped out and she cannot consume any more oxygen, right? Her hemoglobin levels are delivering as much oxygen as possible, but she doesn't have enough hemoglobin. She doesn't have enough mitochondria. Like, so now what's happening is lactic acid's being left over at the end. There's a little bit of extra lactic acid every time. So now, again, she's bringing in 100 units of oxygen and exhaling 100 units of CO2, but she's doing more and more work. So she's producing, let's say, instead of 100 units of lactic acid, she's producing 101 units of lactic acid. So there's a little bit of lactic acid left over. Then another round of metabolism occurs, a little bit more lactic acid is left over, a little bit more. And so it's starting to burn. It's starting to burn like crazy. That's her lactate threshold. And then she's going to push beyond that as far as she can go. And that's going to give her, you know, that's going to show like what her maximal oxygen consumption is. The longer she holds that out above her lactate threshold, you know, that's a sign of like even greater fitness. So you're going to watch her increase her activity here. But if you wanted to know what these tubes are,
Not too
one is oxygen in and one is CO2 out.
Our goal is to max you out in about 10 minutes so that you're not running at too high of an incline and your oxygen consumption gets to that full max along with your heart rate max. During the test, we're graphing the heart rate, so your body's response to the increases in exercise intensity, along with your VO2 relative to your body weight, and the liters per minute, your ventilation during the test. Here we're measuring a variety of variables. The graphs here are showing the heart rate throughout the test, and then this is the VO2, so your oxygen consumption relative to your body weight, and then your ventilation, so how many liters of oxygen and airflow you're moving per minute.
It's kind of fun, right? You can actually see like her heart rate, like as she starts exercising, it's like whoop, right? Big spike in the beginning because your nervous system goes, what are we doing? You know, are you running from? Okay, it's fine. And then it kind of like calms down a little bit, right? And here it even adapted, right? You can even see where it's like, all right, that's not so bad. But it continues to climb. And then here's where it's like kind of hitting pretty hard. And then like, you know, you're going to see it go down. Her oxygen consumption is going to mirror that, right? Like as the intensity, as she hits like that big high intensity, it's going to spike and then she's going to kind of calm down a little bit. And then what she said for the protocols here, you can use different protocols, but the protocol they're using is they picked a set speed and they're increasing the incline every minute. The version of VO2 testing that I like to do is I like to alternate, pick up speed for 1 minute, pick up incline for the next minute, back to speed, back to incline. So I'll start somebody at like a walking pace and then increase the incline by 1, increase the speed by 1 mile per hour, increase the incline by another 1, increase the mile per hour by another mile per hour. You don't need to do this test for a long time. If it takes you 10 minutes to get through the test, it took you too long. If you can get through it in about 5 minutes, that's actually pretty ideal. And it sucks because you're like, nothing. Oh, I guess I'm dying. You know, like you're like going, you know, you do really want to amp the intensity up pretty quickly. Because it's not an endurance test. You're just trying to measure their oxygen consumption. So here she's going to break down the results.
Thanks for watching.
Oh, or not. So that's kind of a fun, that's what a VO2 max test is. That's pretty cool. Take a look. I'm just going to show you the picture here. This is kind of a cool one. Like this has got a rack overhead that kind of keeps that mask from like pulling on the face. But you know what's really cool now, guys? They have actually got these VO2 max test Bluetooth. Check this out. They've got what's called the VO2 Master. I think this is like $5,000. It's pretty pricey, but it corresponds with an app. It has no tubes. It's all taking place like inside the mask, and it's sending all of the signals to your phone. So like if you had a client with a treadmill, you could go to their house and test their VO2 max. And it's like, this is a whole, I mean, you could make your money back because like we used to charge $120 for a VO2 max test, and we would do $120 for a resting metabolism test as well. Which, by the way, like, you know, I got to keep like 50% of. So like I would go do like a 15-minute test and make like $60 and like knock out 3 or 4 of those like in the lunch period at my old job, and like it was just extra money on top of like what you were doing. But the equipment is so specialized and so expensive that it's like a pretty expensive thing to pay for. But here's a freaking bit for those of you who are entrepreneurs, like here's your business model right here, you know? Or if you have like a portable treadmill or a portable, you can do this on spin bikes, by the way. You don't have to do it. You do not have to do this on a treadmill. It can be done on any piece of cardio equipment. You just have to push somebody to the max. Now, here's the other really cool thing. That machine is giving a readout of what their VO2 max is the whole time. You also use a heart rate monitor to measure what their heart rate is. So I love NASM's training zones. You know, I use them all the time. But whenever you know your actual VO2 max, that heart rate is being measured as your VO2 max is going through certain intensities. So you can actually use that and be like, I want your heart rate to be this number because I want you to get just below that lactate threshold so that you can essentially go forever. But then I want you to push beyond the lactate threshold, and then like you can set up intervals based on specific parts of metabolism. And that's another really cool thing about VO2 max tests. It's a big one.
Brad, I have something.
Yeah.
Like when we're doing stuff like that with the clients, do you recommend like them having a like the heart rate monitor that goes around your chest, or like my iWatch has a heart rate monitor, but I don't think that it necessarily works as well. But
so here's how those heart rate monitors work. So your heart rate monitor, your iWatch and my Fitbit are the same tech. They both use a green light that flashes really quickly. The way they work is like green is just on a weird different side of the spectrum than red. And so like your red blood cells show up very easily underneath your skin with that color of light. And what happens is it flashes like this and it counts like whenever it watches like red blood cells rush past. So it's estimating your heart rate by being like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that was over. Your heart rate's 120. You know, like it's watching as blood cells. But the thing is, as your heart rate starts to climb and starts beating really, 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 really fast, that all starts to look like one big rush. And so it gets really hard for the watches to count. So your iWatch and my Fitbit, they're pretty accurate at low intensities. But the higher the intensity, the less accurate they get. Now, the chest strap ones, one thing that we didn't talk about today, but you remember when I was talking about the electric signal that your heart generates? That signal is about -70 millivolts. So whenever you put a chest strap heart rate monitor near your heart, the way that heart rate monitor looks for is it looks for anytime there's a -70 millivolt electric signal being made. And so like it's like measuring the electricity in the air almost, but it's at your heart rate. And so anytime it notices -70 millivolts like got zapped, it knows that it's picking up on the electric signal that your heart generates. So there's no way for it to be inaccurate. So the chest strap ones are definitely more accurate. But the wrist strap ones are good for like other purposes. Like if you're at low intensity, I like the wrist ones. They're way more convenient. But yeah, if you were using like a VO2 test, you would definitely want to use the chest strap ones.
Okay. I know this doesn't have really anything to do with it. Can they put that kind of stuff in the watch eventually, or is it won't read because it's not close enough to the heart?
Yeah, see, that's the problem, right? Like you need to be able to like pick up that signal here, you know? You're not you're generating action potentials all over your entire body. But the action potentials that you're generating at like your wrist are just so much smaller than your chest. Hopefully what they'll come up with, someday is like a very, very convenient, super small version that you would maybe clip onto like your clothing, and then it would just have like a readout associated with your wrist, you know? Like my chest strap monitor, I can read, it does send a signal it sends the readout to my wrist, you know? But like I still have to wear this big bulky chest strap, you know?
Are those things weird to wear like while you're working out?
As long as you're not doing like, I don't wear them when I'm doing strength training, because I am doing like a lot of body position stuff, especially like twisting motions tend to mess it up, or like burpees or push-ups. You know, if your chest is touching the ground, it gets a little weird. But on a run, you don't notice it. Like on a run, it's totally normal. I really like, the one I like is the Polar H10. This is the one that I use. And it took them years, by the way, to come up with this technology. But the reason I like the H10 so much is because you can actually clip the freaking thing off and send this through the wash. Like the old heart rate monitors, what they used to look like, I probably won't be able to find one. Chest strap monitor. The old one used to be these big chunks of plastic. Yeah, it kind of was something like this. Like, see that's all one big chunk. Like you can't send that through the wash. It'll destroy it. So like I used to deal it, dude. They get so nasty.
So stinky. Oh yeah.
It's really bad. Yeah. Oh, I like the H10 because you can put it off and just toss it.
Yeah.
All right. So close to the endpoint of activity, right? Close to the endpoint of an exercise test, there's going to be a point at which your VO2 max will plateau, even if you are increasing the activity, and that is your aerobic capacity. That's your VO2 max, right? So the maximal amount of oxygen consumed. Maximal aerobic capacity is the high, actually, hold on, I want to do that respiratory. This is where I wanted to do the respiratory exchange ratio. So respiratory exchange ratio, okay? This is the ratio of oxygen consumed versus the amount of oxygen present in the body, right? So like as if oxygen comes in to the body and 70% of it is consumed by the body's cells, the respiratory exchange ratio is 0.7, right? So you're always going to be, God dang it, you're always going to be working somewhere between, oh, that's not what I want, exchange ratio. You're always going to be working somewhere between 0.7 and 1.0, right? So this is your respiratory exchange ratio chart right here. We just got done talking about this in our sports class, but like when you are and this is also showing where your fuel sources are coming from, but we'll get to that later. So when you're at rest, you're at a respiratory exchange ratio of 0.7. And when you're at work, you're at a respiratory exchange ratio of 1.0. You're always in some blend in between those two, right? And that's showing you like where you're producing, like what's producing ATP. So if you bring in 100 units of oxygen and you consume all of them, like your body uses up all of them, your respiratory exchange ratio is 1.0. So you're consuming any oxygen present, as well as possibly any oxygen reserves as well. That's where occasionally you'll see it drop above. So, So, yeah, that's how I want to define that, right? I want to make sure I have the right definition there. That's also sometimes known as like your RQ. Yeah, but it is the, actually, here we go. The ratio of oxygen consumed versus the ratio of carbon dioxide expired. Okay, so that right there actually is probably the definition you'll actually end up seeing. I'm pretty sure we have a homework question today related to directly this. So what the ratio is it's like, if we know 100 units go in and 70 units or 30 units come out, we know it's 0.7, right? 70 units of CO2 are coming out because instead of like exhaling oxygen, you're exhaling CO2. So that's what that exchange is. Does that make sense, guys? This gets all messed up because it's not in the slides. I'm trying to free throw it here. But is that clear to everybody? Uh-oh, did I lose you guys? Okay, no. Oh, okay, I'm getting
no, yeah, it's clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We're clear, sorry.
No, you're good. So, all right. So maximal aerobic capacity, highest rate of oxygen you can do. Again, that is your VO2 max. Here's I really like this sentence right here, though. Another way of thinking about VO2 max is it's the power to increase capacity to deliver more oxygen over time. So like the more you train for VO2 max, to develop your VO2 max, the more you are training to increase the power output of the body's cells, right? Because this is all related to like power production. So you can think of your VO2 max as like, okay, well, how much ATP can I produce, you know? How good can I get at this? If you can consume more oxygen, it means that you can do more work and your cells are doing that. So that's where we have like the VO2 max there. Now, obviously, all of that is dependent on how well you can also deliver that oxygen, you know? Like, let's say you were just to somehow like steal some oxidative enzymes from somebody else and inject them into some tissues. Like, cool, I got enzymes for days. But like, if you aren't able to like transport that oxygen efficiently because like you haven't actually trained your heart, it's not really going to matter. You know, there's only so much blood that's going to be delivered. And so that's where like understanding your transport system is important, right? But the oxygen transport system is designed to transport it to the lungs and to all your cellular tissues, AKA your heart rate is designed to like move your, I'm sorry, your cardiovascular system is designed to move all these tissues around. So there is something that is called preload, which is what you guys saw in the VO2 max test. And preload is the volume of blood that stretches your ventricular before the contraction. And so as your heart rate kind of expands a little bit and kind of squeezes, then it like ejects down. That's called your preload. It's kind of like filling a balloon, just like overfilling a balloon a little bit to where it stretches. And then when you like let it go, it kind of ejects everything out there. And we saw that when you noticed like you get a lot of preload. You get preload at the beginning at every heart rate, but you're going to see a high level of it in the beginning. That's why sometimes you'll even see somebody's heart rate dip a little bit, and then it'll start to climb. Or it'll start to climb and then it'll have like a small dip and then go back up. Sometimes that's related to like preload. And so we can measure that with what's called your ejection fraction. Don't worry about this, but that's how much blood is pumped out of the left ventricle with each contraction, right? And so you would use this big long formula to actually calculate how much blood is moving per contraction. You're actually calculating stroke volume. It's very, very difficult to do, not very practical, and that's why we use heart rate instead, because we do know, again, going back to cardiac output, they are linked together. So you're not going to measure your client's VO2 max every single workout, you know, but knowing what it is in the beginning and like calculating like for overall changes, I like to do like my VO2 max test. Like when I can afford it, I like to do it like once or twice a year, you know, just as like a big reset. If I could, I would totally do it like every 3 months, just because it would be so fun. But like, I'm not dropping $100 every 3 months, you know? If I were a professional cardio athlete, obviously I would totally be more into that.
Would you?
So, yeah.
Okay, so this goes back to the CrossFit days, especially with me.
Sure.
Would you consider CrossFit like a complete like a VO2 max training? Because usually everything is for time and you're trying to do all of your workout like as fast as possible to try to not to beat other people, but to beat yourself. Like,
sure.
Would you consider that like a VO2 max training?
Oh
like,
yeah, I mean
every workout.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think anything that elevates your heart rate is VO2 max training. But the best way to increase your VO2 max is to get above that anaerobic threshold, right? You want to get above that point where you are officially producing like more lactic acid than you can burn up with oxygen. The moment you get to like that point, that's how you increase your VO2 max. Because what you're doing is you're telling your body, hey, we need to develop the ability to consume more oxygen because like we can't consume anymore, yet I'm still producing more lactic acid. We need to get better at this. So your body will like create that, you know, it'll start producing more mitochondria, more hemoglobin, and that's how you increase those things. So any type of activity, CrossFit would certainly be included, that elevates your heart rate to a place where you are out of breath is going to increase your VO2 max. And that's where we want to kind of understand the difference, right? There's a difference between like going for a jog and breathing hard and being out of breath. Like we want to be out of breath, right? We want to like end up where it's like, you need to like bring in as much oxygen as possible
like
because you produce so much lactic acid.
Yeah, where you pretty much have to rest kind of.
Yeah, you want to need your rest, you know? That's how you tell your body, oh man, like I should probably develop more ability to consume more of this stuff. And that's, I always use that to my clients. And like, I really, guys, like I'd say one of the biggest things that I've had success with in like a coaching technique that I've developed is like, I always try to retool my clients' mentality when it comes to like, if I'm doing like mixed training where it's like cardio and strength together, I always tell my clients, I'm like, you need to develop this mentality. Like, I want you to do this exercise, that exercise, then I want you to go do 2 minutes of cardio and then come back and do your set. So like, I don't know, push-ups, squat, 20 push-ups, 20 squats, 2 minutes of cardio, 20, 2 minutes of cardio. And I don't want you to think of that cardio as rest. Like, don't think of it as like, oh, I got to go down on a treadmill for 2 minutes. I want you to approach it like this. I want you to approach it with like, what do I have to do to get out of breath in this 2 minutes? What do I have to do like to make it to not 2 minutes? You know, what do I have to do to ensure that I only make it to 1 minute and 58 seconds and then I have to stop or I feel like I'm going to be totally exhausted? That's the mentality you want to have, you know?
Yeah. That changes your training for sure. Like
totally. That takes it from being that, and this is another phrase. I stole this from my old boss, who is not a trainer, but he had a great phrase on this. That's the difference between working out and training. Like you're training for something, you're not just at the gym, you know?
Yep.
I always love that. Randy Huser, that one's to you. Deers are burning.
Let's go, Randy.
Yeah. An individual, so now we're seeing like, we do know about like, when it comes to like the cardiovascular perspective here, a heart that is like 10 beats lower is showing a much more efficient heart, right? An individual with a resting heart rate that's lower than someone else's is showing a much more efficient heart. And so we see changes in heart rate and changes in VO2. They're going to be linear. They're totally related, right? If your VO2 gets better and you get better at consuming more oxygen, your heart rate is going to go down because your quotient, your cardiac output, is also going to go up. VO2 goes up, cardiac output goes up, which we can tell is happening if we go, oh, heart rate is going down, right? If I made you run a mile at the same pace for 3 months, right? And I watched your heart, like it's a treadmill, you know, the pace is determined, your body is the same body the whole time, but your heart rate starts getting lower and lower and lower throughout that. That means it's not exercise anymore. It starts to become routine. This is why another motivating like thing that I always tell people, it's like another like little catchphrasey thing that I like to say. You know, nothing ever gets easier. You just get really good at it, right? Like walking is harder now as an adult than it was when you were a baby. You weigh more, your limbs are longer, like it takes more leverage to be able to move that. Walking is harder than it was when you were a baby, but you are way good at it. So it does not feel hard at all. That's the same thing with your VO2 max, right? You could go at that same pace on the treadmill and like your heart rate's just going to start to adapt to that and it's not going to be considered exercise anymore. Now you need to go do something else. And that's another reason why we like constantly plateau. So there should be a slight decrease in your quotient at rest or during submaximal exercise. And that's all related to mitochondrial content, hemoglobin content, and things like that. So this last little bit here, this is going to be some formula stuff. I don't know why this is actually even in the PowerPoint, but there is like, when we're looking at like some of the math of like how they determine these things, there's what's called like the central model. And the central model is this kind of big complicated formula that uses like how much oxygen is present versus like how much blood is being pumped. So we're just going to move past this because we don't really use formulas. We use machines that do the formulas for us. And that's all because of like your hemo concentrations and things like that. So don't worry about those. I might even just delete those last 2 slides. And that's really how VO2 max works. Do you guys have any questions on any of that? My God, look at that. It's going to be 10. It's 10:59. We might wrap up like I might hit my quota perfectly. Even with all my big, long stories. But do you guys have anything today? Like any questions, comments? How's the rest? I do know respiratory exchange ratios in this homework. And I remember that because I remember being like, it's barely stated in the PowerPoint slides. And I've had students in the past be like, hey, where is this in the slides? It's hardly in there.
Okay.
So yeah. But is that how you guys feeling? Good?
Good. How do you?
Yeah, for sure.
Your max test.
How do you get it?
Yeah.
You can actually, there's a lot of labs that do. I'm telling you, like you could. This is a business I legitimately wanted. You remember I told you?
Yeah.
In the sales class, so there was like an idea that I had.
Mm-hmm.
So you can literally just go VO2 max test near me. I don't have it on screen share. There it is. Oh yeah, look at this. It's a COVID. Yeah, COVID's probably keeping this from happening right now.
Right.
But here's a Yelp 10 best. Straight performance.
This is where they put like the mask on you while you work out, right?
Yeah, it's that mask with the two different tubes, one for oxygen, one
Yep.
for carbon dioxide. Sometimes you won't see
Yeah.
like a second tube. A lot of times actually it'll just be the one tube, and the intake valve is just empty because it can still measure how much oxygen's coming in.
Okay.
But yeah, this would be a place that has it. There we go. There's the website. Yeah. Services. Seriously, where's the? All right, maybe it's not on there. Okay, we're going back. Yelp, you suck. Dexabit. There we go. Okay, this is probably really cool actually. This is literally the type of business I wanted to start. All right, so they have DEXA body composition. So they have a DEXA scan. That's that bone density exam, right? It uses like low-grade X-rays. Or you could get your VO2 max test. You could also get your RMR test. By the way, Maggie, if you buy one, I recommend getting them both because usually they'll give you a discount. The machine, most people who do a VO2 max test use this thing called the Core. And Core is this company that makes this thing called the Cardio Coach. And it's a 2-in-1 machine. Most people will have this one. This is kind of the most popular on the market. And so you can see, like I said, this is an empty valve. It can still measure how much oxygen's coming in, but this is the CO2 tube. And so it goes into the machine. And so the Cardio Coach does VO2 max test, but most people have the model that also, which is the RMR. Anyway, most people have the one that's also an RMR test, and that is like, you know, those formulas that we use to calculate your metabolism, like the calculate like your resting metabolic rate. This is a machine that does it. So it actually measures. So like if the formula was inaccurate, like if you do suspect you have a slow metabolism, this machine can actually help you tell that. Because it's like, oh yeah, sure enough, like you weigh this much, you're this old, you're this gender, like all these things, your metabolism should be 1,500 calories per day. Well, we put you through the machine and it came out to 1,400 calories per day. You have a slow, you know, your metabolism is slightly slower. So it can actually pick up on stuff like that.
So this would be measurements for future goals. This is like a base measurement to see what needs to be improved and, you know, stuff like that, right?
Exactly. Like conceptually, this is the same thing as any other assessment. This is the overhead squat, you know, that tells us what to choose when it comes to exercise. Like if I find that your VO2 max is awesome, but you want, and like, you know, maybe you're just, you know, maybe you have somebody who's like overweight, but their VO2, they actually have great cardio. Well, then developing their cardio is not the problem. I just need to burn some calories with this person, you know? They also do biomarker analysis. Like now that DNA tests are so freaking popular, like that's one. But yeah, you can see they have like a bunch of like different services. This is a business designed, you know, I don't know if they actually like hook people up with trainers, which is like what I wanted to do. But like, you know, there's a bunch of companies out there that do that. There's some mobile ones too. There's like ones that are in trucks that'll come to your house and stuff.
And like, so it, like if they tell you that your metabolism is slower than what your age is or whatever, would like us as trainers be like, okay, so we need to consistently train you in a higher VO2 max training like segment so that way we can.
That would be one solution. You would be like, hey, we got to focus on a higher calorie burn if we're going to create that deficit. But likewise, you could also just be like, hey, we need to, you know, we're going to watch your calorie intake, you know, because that's all. This is actually where we're pivoting into nutrition next class. Like once 105 is over, we're going to get into 107, which is nutrition. And the thing we need to understand is that like weight loss is 100% determined by only one thing: energy in versus energy out. That is weight loss. That is weight gain. That is body composition. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things that determine your energy out. If you do have a slow metabolism, kind of a bummer, you have less energy out, you know, and you're born with that, and there's not a lot we can do about that. But that doesn't mean that we can't still have an effect on the energy in. It's just like that formula that we talked about earlier, right? If I need to get something to equal 100 and I'm stuck with the number 5, I just got to change the first number. I can still get to it,
So like if let's say like somebody's metabolism is slower, and like we limit what their intake is, and we're consistently working harder at their goals fitness wise, does that potentially eventually change their metabolism to where they can like speed it up? Or is it just genetic to where it's like sometimes people are just screwed?
Totally. Sometimes people are metabolically just slower, like sometimes you're born with just a slower metabolism. But again, if we can produce some more of those oxidative enzymes, those are hungry, right? So that brings energy. If we can throw some muscle on somebody, muscle is very hungry. So that's the trick. That's why trainers love legs so much. Like one of the reasons like leg day is so important, 60% of the muscle in your body is in your legs. It's from the waist down. I know it looks like most of the stuff is up top, but most of your body is down below. And so like if I can hide 5 pounds of extra muscle in your legs, doesn't make your jeans look any different. Like you just passively burn 5 pounds of extra energy every day and you look the same, And that like, if I have a client who's like, oh, I'm afraid of like bulking up, it's like, fine, leg day, like that's fine to me. I don't care. Like, I can throw so much muscle on your legs and it will look the same. And that's like really why trainers like legs so much. Also, it burns the most energy as well. So
I have the opposite
there's
effect.
stuff you can do to raise your metabolism, but to say that like, like exercise raises your metabolism, right? But it doesn't do that just passively by being the idea that it's exercise. It raises your metabolism because your body will generate more proteins and enzymes. It'll generate more metabolically hungry things. So it does take work, But if you're born with like a testosterone deficiency, like I actually have really low testosterone, like compared to like most men my age. Like I have like really low levels, and there's things that I can do to like boost it, like higher concentrations of fat in my diet, compound exercises whenever I'm lifting. Like there's things that I can do to like boost that, but like at the end of the day, I'm born with low testosterone, and that's just the reality of what it is. And so that actually slows my metabolism. Now, what's ironic is I have a very fast metabolism actually. I'm actually about 150. When I calculate my metabolism out on using like the formulas that I'm going to teach you next class, when we use those formulas versus like when I get an RMR test, it's about 150 calorie a day difference, which again, that's a classic example of like, if I did do those numbers and I just noticed that I'm not gaining weight and I'm trying to gain weight and it's not happening, well, we know that it's not because like, I'm doing something wrong. We know that like the formula's off, so I just gotta change like my intake. And so it's ironic, like, I actually have low testosterone, but a fast metabolism. And that's because, like I said, I probably come from like a tribe of runners. I come from like a line of like, centuries ago, 2 people who were both like the tribe's best runners maybe got together, like, kind of like, they had babies who were attracted to more runners. And like, so I have like a lot of like oxidative enzymes. Cardio comes very naturally to me. And so like that gives me like a metabolically hungry body. But on the side of like muscle building, that is something that I don't have like a natural like proficiency for, but it doesn't mean that I can't like train for it. However, one thing I'll tell you, every time I do try to train for it, like when I focus on hypertrophy, I'll get into it for a little while and I lose the passion for it quickly. I'm not interested in bodybuilding. It's not something that like stimulates me intellectually, like it's like when I think of working out, like you have the things you like I also don't like spinning. I like running, but I don't like spin bikes. And I think that like this is where biology and psychology intersect. I think like your genes also, sometimes you have like pre-programmed things that you're also more likely to like. There's a reason like some people are just naturally bodybuilders, and that natural bodybuilding thing is what probably led to them walking into a gym one day, because they were like, oh, I should do this. And then they got even more, and it just like their psychology fed into their biology, which fed into their psychology. I think that's something that's also really fun to talk about. But that's a really long conversation.
Yeah. So like for me, for instance, let's say like back in the day, I used to be able to get really big upper body pretty fast. Now I have like the opposite effect now that I'm a little bit older. Like if I do legs, like my legs get like the same size as my waist. Like my legs will get huge, and then my upper body takes longer to like build again.
Yeah.
Is
I
that
wonder
just
if that's interesting. I wonder how much of that could just be like genetics, how much of it could be programming, or it could be like small. And then again, this is kind of a psychology thing. Because I think like human beings are kind of bad. I think we're really good at writing storylines in our head, but we're really bad at noticing all the details sometimes. I wonder if your training style has changed and you're doing more leg stuff, even though it might feel like you're balancing everything out, but like your style has changed slightly over the years.
Okay.
I'd be fascinated to know if that's the case, but that's something that's just like hard to track, you know?
Yeah, that's for sure probably what it is, because back in the day I would not do legs as much. I would do like, I was like, okay, 2 days a week, and then like now I can do some leg exercises every single day to mix in a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's like you just sometimes we're just not really great at like noticing stuff like that, you know. But it's like something else changed, and we don't pay attention to that. We pay attention to something else. You know, like if I moved to Southern California, like I did, and like I suddenly started like I make jokes about how like I'm pale my whole life. I can't tan to save my life because I just don't produce enough of that protein. And then all of a sudden I started noticing that like I'm tanning more. And then I'm like, I wonder if as I got older, because I moved to LA when I was older, it's like, I wonder if as I got older, my genes changed and now I'm tan. It's like, no, you moved to a higher, like, so sometimes I think we draw the wrong connections without like noticing it. So it could be that like your style has changed and you're not quite aware of it, you know?
Okay.
I'm not saying that's what happened, but I would love to, like, that's like my favorite stuff to talk about. I love talking about the stuff that we don't notice. That's like some of my favorite bar conversation food.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So.
Yeah, no kidding, right? Good Lord. All right, guys. I'm going to let everybody out of here. For those of you who watched the video, we got a long one today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Brad?
Oh, yeah.
Quick question. Are we allowed to go into Sochi and print out our notes?
Totally. Absolutely.
Is there a max limit?
No, there is not. Absolutely not. We will accommodate you all day. Just make sure, wear a mask, and I think the front desk is also requesting gloves. So that's not really cool, but like we'd appreciate it. If you've got them. And yeah, you can do that anytime you want, Nancy. If you want, let me know what you want printed, and I can send it over to the team. Or you can just bring copies of it and be like, hey, can you print this?
I still need 2 books too.
Oh gosh, yeah, Maggie, we gotta get you over to Sochi. They got them down there. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna make a payment sometime in the next week or so. So maybe we can coordinate that when I go down there.
Perfect. Yep. And we do have Friday, July 3rd off. Don't forget that.
Got it. Okay.
That is mostly for the people watching the recording, because I was like, I don't know if I mentioned it before we started recording or not. Yeah. All right, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
See you tomorrow, guys.
See you guys. Bye.